All right, ready to dig into some March gardening. I know our listeners are all about that sustainable, organic approach, and everyone wants a garden that's bursting with life once spring really gets going.
Definitely. And it seems like every year, gardeners are always asking that same question.
Oh, yeah.
Is it too late? Can I still start? And March is sort of that sweet spot where you can actually get away with a lot, even if you're just starting out.
Well, that's good news for some of us, right? But speaking of starting out, we've got an awesome guide to help us out today. It's from Petit Garden Paradise, their article, What to Plant in March, Organic Gardening Guide for Sustainable Harvests.
Great article. They really hit on some key points that I think are going to be super helpful for anyone listening, no matter what their experience level is.
For sure. And before we really get into the specifics of what to plant, there's this myth that March is too late to even bother starting a garden.
Ah, yes.
Can we just debunk that right away? I mean, can you actually get a good harvest even if you're just getting started now?
Oh, absolutely. The article jumps right on that myth. It all boils down to your USDA hardiness zone. It's like your personalized planting calendar based on your region. They even have a link in the article where you can just pop in your zip code and bam, you know your zone.
Super handy. So let's say you're in one of those colder zones, like 3 to 5. Does that mean you're just stuck daydreaming about tomatoes until things warm up?
Not at all. March is actually the perfect time to focus on what we call frost-tolerant crops. These are those tough plants that can handle a little chill, kale, spinach, peas. Those guys actually prefer cooler temperatures.
Seriously. They like the cold.
Yeah. Kale, for instance, those thick, curly leaves, it's like they have built-in insulation, keeps that core nice and toasty. And peas, well, they're practically begging to be planted in cool soil.
So we're not just talking about surviving, we're talking thriving. That's pretty encouraging for those of us who don't exactly live in, year-round sunshine.
Right. And the best part is, these frost-tolerant crops are fast-growing too. Some, like radishes, can be ready to harvest in less than a month. So even if you're a bit late to the game, you can still get those fresh veggies early in the season.
That's awesome. So for those who are already dreaming of those warm season veggies,
Yeah.
the tomatoes, peppers, basil, but they're stuck waiting for that last frost to pass. What do they do?
That's when the magic of indoor seed starting comes in. The article has a great section on this, stressing how important timing is. For those warm season crops, they need a head start, like 6 to 8 weeks indoors, before they can handle the outdoors.
Oh, like a little spa vacation before they face the real world.
Pretty much. And they even mention a specific hack for those in Zone 5B, start your zucchini indoors in late March. Sounds counterintuitive, right? But a little indoor pampering helps them hit the ground running once it's warm enough to transplant.
I'm taking notes. Now, what about those sneaky late frosts? You think spring has sprung, and then, bam, everything's frozen again.
Yep, those can be brutal. The article suggests row covers, also called frost blankets. They basically create a mini greenhouse effect, protect those tender seedlings.
Like a little cozy fort for your plants.
Exactly. So no matter where you live, there's a way to get that garden going in March.
Perfect. But of course, we want to do all of this while staying true to that organic approach. And that's where the article gets really interesting. Ditching the chemical quick fixes and going all in on organic methods, especially when it comes to soil health.
Totally agree. And March is actually the perfect time to focus on soil because it's just waking up after winter so vulnerable.
Oh, I see. So it's not just what we're putting into the plants, but what we're putting into the soil.
Exactly. The article makes a great analogy. It compares synthetic fertilizers to junk food for your soil.
Hmm.
You get a quick burst of energy, but long term, you're actually depleting the soil, killing those beneficial microbes, and ultimately harming the ecosystem.
Hmm. So how do we approach soil health in a way that actually benefits it, especially in March?
Organic matter, my friend. Compost, for example. The article calls it a probiotic smoothie for your soil. It's packed with those good bacteria and fungi that help plants access nutrients and fight off diseases.
Makes sense. So we're feeding the life within the soil, not just the plants themselves.
That's the idea. And they have a simple but effective tip. Brew some compost tea. Just steep compost in water, add a little molasses for the microbes, aerate it for a couple days, then spray this nutrient-rich magic potion on your soil or seedlings.
I like it. And of course, we want to be thinking about those pollinators who are also just waking up this time of year.
Absolutely. The article is big on protecting pollinators. They're so crucial for a healthy garden, and March is when they're starting to emerge. So avoiding those harsh pesticides, opting for more organic pest control methods that creates a much safer environment for them.
It's all connected, right? The soil, the pollinators, the plants, and ultimately us.
You got it. That's the whole point of organic gardening, working with nature, not against it. Building that sustainable system that benefits everyone.
I'm all for that. Now let's talk about what we can actually plant in March. I'm ready to get my hands dirty.
Let's do it. Well, in March, it's not just about what you plant, but how you plant it. The article dives into some pretty crucial strategies for making sure you're set up for success, things like crop rotation, making the most of your water, and of course, keeping those pollinators happy.
Okay, crop rotation. I know it's important, but honestly, I think a lot of people get intimidated by it.
I get it. It can seem like a big puzzle, but think of it more like a carefully planned dance for your soil.
Yeah.
And March is the perfect time to start choreographing. The article has a whole section on crop rotation specifically for March. For example, you want to avoid planting nightshades. Those are your tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. Avoid planting them in the same spot they were last year. Instead, rotate them with some leafy greens or legumes.
So no repeat performances for the nightshades. Got it. But why is that so important?
It all comes down to soil health. Different plants take different nutrients from the soil. So rotating them prevents what we call nutrient depletion, basically giving the soil a chance to, catch its breath and replenish itself.
Ah, so it's like a balanced diet for your soil. I
Yeah.
like that analogy. And you mentioned legumes. Those are like the superstars of the garden, right?
Definitely. Legumes, things like peas, they have this amazing ability to pull nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil. It's like free fertilizer. The article suggests planting them alongside or even before heavy feeders like kale or broccoli. Gives them a nice boost.
So peas are like the ultimate team players, making everyone around them stronger. I love it. Now, what about water? March can be so unpredictable, droughts one minute, downpours the next. How do we conserve water effectively when we don't even know what the weather's going to do?
All right, it's a challenge. Luckily, the article's got some great tips for water conservation in March, starting with mulching.
Mulch. I have to admit, sometimes I think people just use it because it looks nice.
Oh, it definitely does spruce things up, but it's so much more than that. Think of it as a protective shield for your soil. Helps retain moisture, suppress those pesky weeds, and even regulates the soil temperature.
And so it's not just a pretty face. What kind of mulch do they recommend?
They suggest straw or shredded leaves, which is great because as they break down, they actually add nutrients back into the soil. It's a win-win.
I like that. So mulching is like multitasking in the garden. What about other ways to conserve water, especially during those dry spells?
Well, they talk about rainwater harvesting. Even something as simple as a rain barrel under your downspout can collect a surprising amount of water that you can then use to water your garden.
Oh, yeah, I've been meaning to set one up. What about like actual watering techniques? Any tips for making sure every drop counts?
They really emphasize deep, infrequent watering. Basically, giving your plants a good soak once or twice a week rather than those little sprinkles every day. It encourages the roots to grow deeper, makes them more drought tolerant.
So it's like quality over quantity when it comes to watering.
Precisely. And for those listeners in drier climates like zones 9 and 10, they have a really cool suggestion. Olals.
Oh, those are new to me.
They're unglazed clay pots that you bury in the soil near your plants. You fill them with water, and it slowly seeps out into the surrounding soil. It's super efficient, and your plants love it.
That's amazing. Okay, so we've covered crop rotation, water conservation. What else do we need to think about in terms of sustainable practices in March?
Let's not forget about our pollinator friends. March is when they're just starting to wake up and look for food, so we need to make our gardens welcoming.
I'm picturing a tiny little bee welcome, Matt. But seriously, how do we create that pollinator-friendly environment, especially so early in the season?
One of the best things you can do is plant early blooming flowers, things like calendula, borage, or some nice native wildflowers. They provide that much needed nectar and pollen when those pollinators are just coming out of hibernation.
It's like setting up a buffet for them. And of course, avoiding pesticides that can harm those beneficial insects.
Absolutely. The article's really big on sticking to organic pest control methods, things like companion planting, which we talked about earlier, or using natural predators like ladybugs to help keep those pest populations under control. It's all about creating that balance.
Okay, so we've got crop rotation, water conservation, happy pollinators. Sounds like we've got all our sustainability bases covered for March.
I think so. And remember, it's not about being perfect, it's about making progress. Every little step counts.
True that. Now, I'm ready to talk about the actual plants we can put in the ground this month. Let's get specific. What are some of those cool season crops that thrive in March, even when it's still a little chilly out there?
All right, let's dive in. You mentioned peas earlier, and the article is all about them too. They're hardy, they grow fast, and as we talked about, they actually improve the soil.
Yeah, peas are awesome. What kind do they recommend?
They suggest trying sugar snap or snow peas. Get this, they actually get sweeter after a frost.
Really? Frost makes them sweeter. That's wild. Okay, I'm definitely planting those. What else can we direct sow in March?
Leafy greens are a must-have, of course. Kale, spinach, lettuce, they all love those cool temperatures.
Can't go wrong with fresh salads.
Exactly. And they specifically mention red Russian kale. It's super cold hardy and adds a beautiful pop of color to the garden.
I do love a good pop of color. Oh, and the article also mentions pairing peas and lettuce in raised beds. They call them the ultimate spring power couple.
Yeah, they really complement each other perfectly, both in terms of how they grow and their nutrient needs. It's a match made in gardening heaven.
Okay, sold. Peas and lettuce, it is. Now, what about tomatoes? Is it too early to even think about those juicy, homegrown beauties?
Well, it really depends on your hardiness zone. The article breaks it down pretty clearly. In colder zones, like 3 through 7, it's best to start your tomato seeds indoors this month. Give them that head start before you can plant them outside once it's warm enough. But if you're in a warmer zone, like 8 through 10, you can actually direct sow tomato seeds right into the ground in March.
So those warm zone gardeners have a bit of a head start when it comes to tomatoes. Lucky ducks. But no matter where you live, there's a way to get those tomatoes growing. Now, I want to circle back to the foundation of it all, the soil. The article provides a really helpful soil prep checklist, and I think March is the ideal time to tackle this.
Couldn't agree more. They recommend starting 2 to 4 weeks before you plan to plant anything, which gives you plenty of time to assess, amend, and nourish your soil.
Okay, let's break it down step by step. First things first.
First, you got to test your soil's pH. We talked about those easy vinegar and baking soda tests earlier. Super simple to do. Once you know your pH, you can adjust it if you need to.
Got it. Soil testing, check. Then what?
Then, time to do a little spring cleaning in your garden beds. Clear out any debris from last season, old mulch, leaves, weeds, anything that's hanging around. Lets that soil breathe and warm up properly.
Okay, beds are cleared, soil is tested. What's next?
Time to feed the soil. They recommend adding a nice layer of nutrient-rich compost or aged manure. Not only does this add essential nutrients, but it also improves the soil structure, which is so important for healthy root growth.
So we're basically giving the soil a nice, healthy meal before we ask it to do all that hard work of growing our plants.
Exactly. And then the final step is to double-check your zone-specific timing. They have a handy chart for that in the article. Colder zones, like 3 to 5, you want to wait until late March to prep your beds, once the snow's melted and the ground's thawed.
Makes sense. What about those in more temperate zones, like 6 to 8?
They can usually start prepping their beds mid-March. The soil should be workable by then.
And those lucky folks in zones 9 and 10.
They can jump right in and start prepping their beds early March.
Ah, the joys of living in a warm climate. So we've prepped our soil, we've got our seeds and plants ready to go. We're feeling good about our sustainable practices now. What happens after we've actually planted everything? What about that post-planting care?
That's when things get really exciting. But also, yeah, a little bit nerve-wracking.
For sure. I'll be honest, even after all these years of gardening, that post-planting phase still gets me a little, I don't know, anxious.
Yeah.
It's like you've done all the prep work, you've put those seeds or seedlings in the ground, but then it's like...
You're just waiting and hoping for the best.
Exactly. Like sending your kid off to their first day of school.
Yeah.
You've prepped them as much as you can, but you're still a little nervous about how they'll handle it.
Oh, I totally get that. But that's also part of what makes this stage so rewarding, right? You get to watch those little sprouts emerge and grow. The article really emphasizes the idea of becoming a keen observer of your garden. Spend time out there, not just for watering or weeding, but really just looking at your plants, noticing how they're doing.
So it's less about micromanaging and more about being a mindful observer. Makes sense. But what should we be looking for specifically? What are some signs that maybe our plants need a little extra help?
Well, they mentioned damping off, which is a fungal disease that can affect seedlings. It's heartbreaking because it can wipe out a whole tray of seedlings if you're not careful. You'll notice the stems they get weak and mushy, and sometimes the seedlings just collapse.
Oh, no. So how do we prevent that from happening?
The article suggests using a sterile seed starting mix, making sure there's good air circulation and not overwatering. And here's a little extra tip that I've found helpful. Sprinkle a little bit of cinnamon on top of the soil.
Cinnamon? Really?
Yeah, it sounds weird, but cinnamon has natural antifungal properties, so it can help protect those seedlings.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm going to try that. Now, what about watering after we've planted? Is it just like water as much as possible, or is there a more nuanced approach?
Overwatering is definitely a common mistake. The article really stresses keeping the soil moist, but not soggy. Remember, those roots are still developing, and they need air to breathe.
Right, right. So it's all about finding that balance.
Exactly. And they suggest using a gentle watering can or a soaker hose so that you're delivering the water directly to the soil without splashing those delicate little leaves.
Okay, good tips. What about thinning? I know it's necessary, but it always feels a little brutal, like choosing which of your seedlings gets to live or die.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It can feel a bit like playing God. But thinning is important because it gives those remaining seedlings enough space to really grow and flourish.
So how do we choose who stays and who goes?
They recommend waiting until the seedlings have a few true leaves, and then you carefully snip off the excess ones at the soil level, leaving the strongest and healthiest ones to thrive.
Hmm, makes sense. And what do we do with those seedlings that we've thinned out? Just toss them in the compost.
Well, a lot of times, especially with leafy greens like lettuce or spinach, those thin seedlings can actually be eaten as microgreens.
Oh, that's a great idea. Waste not, want not.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about watering, thinning, preventing damping off, anything else we need to be thinking about in terms of post-planting care.
Oh, what about supporting those vining plants like peas and tomatoes? Do we need to be doing anything special for
Oh,
them?
good point. Yeah, the article mentions that. As those plants start to grow, a simple trellis or stake can make a huge difference. Keeps those vines from sprawling all over the place and helps with air circulation.
It's like giving them a little scaffolding to help them climb. I like that. One thing I was curious about, the article mentions regenerative gardening as a way to really take your gardening to the next level. What exactly does that mean?
It's a fascinating concept, and it goes beyond just sustainability. It's about actively improving the health of your soil and the ecosystem as a whole, not just maintaining, but actually regenerating.
Hmm, interesting. But also maybe a bit intimidating. Is that something we can realistically tackle in March?
Honestly, the article doesn't get too deep into the specifics of regenerative gardening, but it definitely plants the seed, so to speak.
I see what you did there.
And, that's the beauty of gardening, right? It's a constant learning process.
Well said. And I think that's a great place to wrap things up for today. We've covered so much in this deep dive into March gardening, everything from soil prep and planting to sustainable practices, and even a little glimpse into the world of regenerative gardening.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation.
It really has. And as always, we encourage you to share your own gardening experiences with us, your triumphs, your challenges, your questions. Let's create a community of gardeners who support and inspire each other. Happy gardening, everyone.